Ethan Walker had always believed that marriages didn't fall apart suddenly. They unraveled quietly, thread by thread, in moments small enough to excuse, but heavy enough to remember. Lately, everything in his home felt like one of those moments. Caleb Brooks, his husband, had become a stranger moving through familiar rooms, leaving behind empty explanations and half-finished promises. Every night, Caleb came home later than the one before. Every morning, he left earlier. And somewhere in between those hours, Ethan felt himself slipping into a version of life where he no longer recognized the person he loved. He tried not to assume the worst. He reminded himself that work was demanding, that Caleb had always been social, that friendships came easily to him. But the little changes were impossible to ignore. Caleb turned his phone upside down, taking calls outside, and in conversations the second Ethan entered the room. These weren't the habits of someone who was simply stressed. They were the habits of someone hiding something. Ethan felt it in the silence, in the way Caleb kissed his cheek too quickly, as if fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing affection. Love used to fill the house in invisible ways. Now he felt only echoes. Ethan had always been loyal, steady, the kind of man who did his best to carry burdens without placing them on others. But even he had limits. He found himself waking up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, wondering when his marriage had begun bending toward a breaking point. His friends noticed he had lost weight, that he no longer made jokes, that his energy dimmed. When they asked if he was okay, Ethan simply smiled and blamed the stress of work. He didn't have the courage to admit that the person hurting him most was the one he loved most. Then Mason Hill showed up. Mason had been Caleb's college friend, tall, calm, the kind of man whose presence made rooms feel less chaotic. He arrived in town for a temporary work assignment and reached out to Caleb. Caleb invited him over for dinner, but when the day arrived, Caleb texted Ethan that he'd be home late, asking him to entertain Mason alone until he arrived. Ethan felt awkward about it, but he agreed. When Mason walked through the door, he offered Ethan a warm smile that felt surprisingly grounding. And the moment he took in Ethan's tired expression, his brows narrowed with genuine concern. "You okay, man?" Mason asked, simple, direct, honest. Ethan hadn't heard those words in weeks. He brushed it off, insisting everything was fine, but Mason didn't push. He simply stayed present, talking about work, sharing stories, filling the silence Caleb had been leaving behind. Ethan appreciated it more than he admitted. For the first time in a long time, someone was actually looking at him, noticing him, not walking past him as if he were fading into the background. Later that evening, Ethan remembered the broken shelf Caleb had asked him to fix days earlier. It had been wobbling for months, and tonight felt like a good distraction. He grabbed the screws, a small tool set, and knelt on the living room floor to tighten the brackets. The shelf sat low, forcing him to lean forward awkwardly while reaching underneath. "Hold on," Mason said, walking over. "You're going to tip that whole thing over on yourself." "I've got it," Ethan insisted, though his arms were already straining. "No, you don't," Mason replied with a half-laugh. "Trust me, get on all fours so you can brace yourself. I'll keep the shelf steady." The moment made Ethan laugh despite himself. It felt ridiculous, vulnerable, strangely human. Still, he did as instructed, positioning himself so he could reach the screws without losing balance. Mason crouched behind him. Not close, not inappropriate, just supportive. His hands gently steadied the wooden shelf, and one hand settled briefly on Ethan's shoulder to help him keep balance. It wasn't intimate. It wasn't inappropriate. But it was grounding. For months, Ethan had felt like he was collapsing inward, unsupported, unheard. Yet here was someone offering simple, genuine help without expecting anything in return. It startled him how much that small gesture affected him. Not in a romantic way. Not yet. Just in a way that reminded him he deserved kindness. When they finished, Ethan stood and wiped dust from his hands just as the front door opened. Caleb stepped inside, eyes narrowing instantly as he took in the scene. Mason crouched beside the shelf, Ethan still steadying himself. "What's going on?" Caleb asked, his tone sharper than usual. Ethan opened his mouth to explain, but something in Caleb's expression stopped him. It wasn't confusion, it was irritation. And behind that irritation, something else flickered. Guilt, maybe, or fear. For the first time, Ethan realized that whatever was happening between him and Caleb was bigger than missed calls and late nights. Something was about to crack wide open, and the moment Mason's hand had touched his shoulder, the course of everything began to shift. Ethan didn't sleep much that night. After Caleb's sharp tone and suspicious glare, the house felt heavier than usual. Mason stayed only a few minutes longer before leaving, giving Ethan a reassuring nod that said more than words could. When the door finally closed behind him, Ethan stood alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at the fixed shelf they had worked on. It was perfectly steady now, something Ethan wished he could say about his marriage. Caleb acted strangely all evening. He didn't ask about Ethan's day, didn't mention why he was late, didn't explain why he had reacted so defensively when he arrived. Instead, he walked straight to the kitchen, grabbed a drink, and disappeared into the bedroom without another word. Ethan followed some minutes later, but Caleb had already locked himself in the bathroom. The sound of running water drowned out any chance of conversation. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together, feeling the weight of an unspoken truth pressing heavier on his chest. He remembered the way Caleb's expression had shifted when he saw him and Mason together. Not jealousy, but fear. The kind of fear people have when they're worried their secrets are about to surface. Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what Caleb was hiding, and why his gut feeling had grown so loud it could no longer be ignored. The next morning, things grew worse. Caleb rushed around the room getting dressed, barely acknowledging Ethan. Every question Ethan asked, "Are you okay? Do you want breakfast? Can we talk later?" was met with a clipped, impatient answer. When Caleb finally grabbed his keys, he paused at the doorway just long enough to deliver a sentence that stung in ways Ethan didn't expect. Maybe don't get too comfortable with Mason. He's friendly in ways that can be misleading. Ethan froze. What's that supposed to mean? Caleb shrugged, pretending to be casual. Just saying. People talk. You know how it is. And then he was gone. Ethan stood in the silent kitchen, staring at the door long after it closed. The accusation wasn't subtle. Caleb was deflecting, trying to shift the spotlight away from himself. It was a tactic Ethan had seen in others, but never expected from the man he married. The realization hit him hard. Caleb was hiding something significant, and he was trying to make Ethan feel guilty for noticing it. By midday, Ethan still couldn't shake the tension. He was sorting through bills when his phone buzzed. A text from Mason. "Just checking on you. You seemed stressed last night." Ethan hesitated before replying. He didn't want to look dramatic or clingy, but he also didn't want to sink deeper into silence. "Rough morning. Thanks for asking." Mason responded immediately. "I'm grabbing coffee nearby. Want me to swing by?" No pressure. Ethan wasn't sure why, but the offer felt like a lifeline. "Yeah," he wrote. "I'd appreciate that." When Mason arrived, he didn't barge in with forced cheer or prying questions. He simply handed Ethan a warm cup and sat with him at the dining table. The quiet between them wasn't tense. It was calm, supportive. "You look like you haven't slept," Mason said softly. "Didn't," Ethan admitted. "Things with Caleb, they're complicated." Mason nodded. "You don't need to explain anything you're not ready to." Those words alone unraveled something inside Ethan. People rarely offered him space without also expecting answers. He found himself talking. Not everything, but enough. He explained the late nights, the secrecy, the sudden defensiveness. Mason listened without interrupting, without jumping conclusions. When Ethan finished, Mason leaned back, thoughtful. "Sounds like you've been carrying this alone for a long time." "I didn't want to assume anything," Ethan said. "I didn't want to make Caleb into the villain if there was another explanation." "There's a difference between assuming and noticing patterns," Mason said gently. "And you're not wrong for wanting honesty." Before Ethan could respond, Mason's expression shifted. He glanced toward the living room. "Is that Caleb's tablet?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, he left it this morning." Mason hesitated. "Ethan, if you feel something's off, maybe you deserve clarity." Ethan didn't want to snoop. It felt wrong. But he also knew he had reached his limit. With trembling hands, he picked up the tablet and pressed the power button. It unlocked without a passcode, Caleb must have been rushing too much to notice. Notifications lit up the screen. Messages, missed calls, and one conversation pinned to the top, labeled only with an initial. He tapped it. What he read felt like someone had dropped a weight through his chest. Messages were non-explicit, but unmistakably intimate. Late-night plans, emotional confessions, Caleb promising someone that he was figuring things out at home. Ethan's vision blurred. The betrayal wasn't physical. Not yet, at least, but emotional infidelity was its own kind of wound. A sound escaped Ethan's throat. Small, broken. Mason moved instantly, standing beside him, steadying him with a hand on his back. "Ethan," he said softly, "I'm here. You're not alone." Ethan covered his face, trying to breathe, but each inhale trembled. The truth he had been trying so hard to avoid was now undeniable. Caleb hadn't just drifted away. He had chosen someone else. And as Ethan sat there shaking, Mason didn't push him, didn't pity him. He simply stayed, a quiet anchor in a world that had suddenly overturned. That afternoon, Ethan packed a small bag, not out of anger, but out of sheer necessity. And when Ethan stepped outside, Mason was waiting by his truck, offering nothing but a place to breathe. Ethan swallowed hard and nodded. I can't stay here tonight." "Then you won't," Mason said gently. "Let's go." Ethan expected the world to feel different the moment he stepped out of his house, but it didn't. The sky looked the same. The street was quiet. The breeze was soft. Everything on the outside remained unchanged, yet inside him, something had cracked wide open. The bag he carried felt heavier than it should have, as if every disappointment, every unanswered question, every ignored feeling was packed inside with his clothes. When he reached Mason's truck, Mason didn't rush him or ask if he was sure. Instead, he simply opened the passenger door and waited. The drive to Mason's place was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Ethan stared out the window, watching the familiar neighborhood blur by. He wasn't running away, he told himself. He was stepping back, so he could see things clearly. That thought alone brought a strange mix of relief and grief. Mason glanced over a few times, checking on him without speaking. The simple presence was comforting in ways Ethan hadn't realized he needed. Mason lived in a clean, modest apartment on the second floor of a small building. When they stepped inside, he motioned toward the couch, though he seemed unsure whether Ethan wanted to sit, pace, or fall apart. Ethan appreciated that uncertainty. It meant Mason wasn't trying to control the situation or make it about himself. He was just offering space. "You can take the spare room," Mason said gently. "It's not fancy, but it's yours as long as you need it." Ethan nodded, feeling his throat tighten. "Thank you. Really." "Don't thank me yet," Mason replied with a soft chuckle. "The bed in there squeaks if you breathe too hard." For the first time all day, Ethan laughed, small, tired, but real. The moment felt like a tiny crack of light in a dark room. Mason smiled at the sound, then walked to the kitchen. "I'm making dinner," he called out. "Sit, relax, or, cry, whatever you need." Ethan didn't cry, not then. Instead, he sat on the couch and stared at his hands, trying to make sense of everything he had lost in a single afternoon. He wondered how long Caleb had been emotionally elsewhere when the messages had started, whether Caleb had ever planned to tell him, whether Ethan had been holding on to something that only he believed still existed. When Mason returned with 2 bowls of pasta, he didn't ask questions. They ate in silence, the gentle kind that didn't demand answers. And when Ethan finally felt the weight of exhaustion pull him toward bed, Mason simply nodded and let him go. But after midnight, Ethan woke to the sound of rain tapping against a window. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then it all rushed back. Caleb's messages, the hurt, the confusion, the silence. He sat up, feeling the ache settle deep in his chest. A soft knock at the door made him look up. "Ethan? You awake?" "Yeah," Ethan answered quietly. Mason pushed the door open a little, keeping his voice careful. "You don't have to talk, but if you need company, I'm here." Ethan hesitated only a moment before nodding. They sat in the living room again, wrapped in the dim glow of a small lamp. The rain softened everything outside, creating a lullaby-like rhythm behind their quietness. "I keep wondering what I did wrong," Ethan finally whispered. Mason exhaled slowly. You love someone who stopped loving you the right way. That's not your mistake. Ethan swallowed, his eyes damp. Why wasn't I enough? You were, Mason said firmly. Caleb's choices aren't about your worth. They're about his honesty. Something about the conviction in Mason's voice broke the final barrier Ethan had been holding up. His breath caught, and he covered his face with his hands. Mason didn't touch him, not at first. He waited, letting Ethan's grief spill out lightly, quietly. When Ethan finally lowered his hands, Mason placed a warm, steady palm on his back. That small gesture nearly undid him. After a long moment, Ethan whispered, It hurts more than I thought it would. I know, Mason replied softly, and it's going to hurt for a while, but it won't break you. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, trying to breathe through the ache. Mason didn't push him to move, to comment, or to decide anything. He simply sat there, solid, safe, unshakable. The next morning, Caleb showed up. Ethan saw his husband's car through the window before he heard the knock. His chest tightened, but he opened the door anyway. Caleb looked worn, guilty, panicked. Ethan, please, can we talk? Mason stood up from the couch, but Ethan raised a small hand to show he had it under control. They stepped outside under the gray sky. Caleb spoke quickly, words stumbling over themselves. It wasn't what you think. I was confused. I made mistakes. I still love you. Please come home. Ethan listened, but something inside him felt strangely calm. He realized that he had waited months, years maybe, for Caleb to fight for him, and now that it was happening, it didn't feel like love. It felt like desperation. Too late, too small, too fragile. I needed honesty, Ethan said quietly, and you gave it to someone else. Caleb's face fell, but Ethan continued. I'm choosing myself this time. I'm choosing peace. When Ethan walked back toward Mason's apartment, something heavy lifted. Mason opened the door before Ethan reached it, and their eyes met in a moment of understanding. No pressure, no expectations, just a shared recognition of the road ahead. In the weeks that followed, Ethan slowly rebuilt himself. He found a small place of his own. Mason helped him move, helped him breathe, helped him remember who he was before heartbreak dulled his light. Their bond grew softly, naturally, without crossing boundaries too soon. It was patient, respectful, quietly hopeful. Months later, as they stood on Ethan's new balcony watching the sunset, Mason glanced at him and smiled. You seem lighter. I feel lighter, Ethan replied. And in that moment, surrounded by calm skies and healing air, Ethan realized that sometimes a heart breaks not to end something, but to make room for something healthier, steadier, and unexpectedly beautiful.